So today, I finished reading this book, Killers of the Flower Moon. It covers an incredible story of a killing spree of 24 people in Osage Nation, North Oklahoma. The Osage tribe, as was the norm with Native American Indian people, faced constant hostility from the white Americans and a whole series of relocations spanning decades. Their final relocation occurred in 1872 as they were pushed completely off their homelands and onto this relatively small patch of land where they remain to this day. So all in all, about 113 million acres of land were transferred from the Osage to the American government and their allies. The Osage were given full rights over their new land, and the white pioneers clearly got the better side of the deal here. I mean, just look at that map. But just before the turn of the century, the Osage lucked out. A huge oil reserve was found under their land, and as the Osage were given the rights to all of the resources associated with their territory, they sold these plots and charged royalties to the white oil tycoons. Each member of this Osage tribe was given a head right, which entitled them to frequent payments from the revenue made selling the oil on communal Osage land. So within just a few decades, the Osage became the richest community on Earth without working very hard at all.
This feels like that the resource curse, which is where people who find a lot of oil and natural resources end up suffering because of corruption and all sorts of reasons like that, is about to kick in, and we're going to see some less than ideal situations play out, shall we say.
Certainly, because murder always chases money, and the Osage had money. Through the 1920s, many members of the Osage tribe met their end in what is now dubbed the Reign of Terror. The policing, if you could even call it that, in Osage Nation wasn't great. There weren't many crimes to begin with, of course, as everyone was so damn rich, but the officials were either all useless or simply didn't exist. However, William Hale, he was a wealthy white rancher and ex-cowboy who settled in Osage County, and he was always donating to local schools and helping the Indians out. Hale would also take justice into his own hands, helping to fight crime for the Osage and earning himself the nickname King of the Osage. Everyone loved him, and Hale amassed incredible power whilst remaining a fatherly figure to many. Molly Kyle was a full-blood Osage, and married to the love of her life, Ernest Buckart. Together, they had 3 children and lived very well alongside her mother, Lizzie. But in 1921, that changed. Lizzie died. Initially thought to be due to old age, but much later, suspected of being poisoned to a slow and painful death over several months. This came just 2 months after her daughter and Molly's sister Anna were shot to death. And a couple years later, late Lizzie's nephew Henry Roan was found dead, slumped over in his car with a bullet hole penetrating the back of his head. That same year, another of Molly's sisters was killed when a violent explosion destroyed her house in the early hours of March the 10th. Her husband survived the blast, but he passed away in hospital a few days later. Now, clearly, this is very suspicious. I mean, any half-asleep toddler can tell you that. 5 people from the same family died within 2 years of each other. So, Quan, who do you think it was? Who could have masterminded these?
My first thought goes to somebody who is a white oil tycoon, because it feels like it would be very convenient if, due to certain circumstances, they no longer had to pay people to drill oil. Intriguing.
So let's just continue with the story and see whether you're right or not. So Molly was quickly ticked off the suspect list, as she had strong alibis and was genuinely affected by the deaths of her loved ones. However, there was an even more obvious reason as to why she wasn't the murderer. She was being led to the same slow and painful death that her mother faced. Molly became weaker, and her illness began to overcome her, her body failing as she became frailer by the day. Luckily, however, as soon as she moved to a trusted hospital, she made a quick and full recovery. So Someone close to her was poisoning her. Molly was diabetic, and being a rich member of the Osage, she could afford the latest treatment from a local doctor. She was given frequent insulin injections by the Shun brothers, a pair of respected doctors in Osage Nation. Except that her latest injections were certainly not insulin. But a very good reason to pin the blame of the murders on Molly was the fortune she inherited. The head rights of the Osage people were the most valuable thing they owned. It's what gave them control over the oil-encrusted land that led to tens of thousands of dollars flowing in, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. When Lizzie died, she had 3 people's worth of head rights. 3 people, all of which went down to Molly. Molly became insanely rich. But Henry Roan's head rights didn't go to Molly, so why was he killed? What connection lies between Roan and Molly? Well, Henry Roan took a $1,200 loan from Hale, and didn't seem like he'd pay it back anytime soon. He actually lived in poverty for most of his life, and his 9 or 10 kids, once he died, also lived in poverty. So Roan agreed to let Hale take a life insurance policy for Roan and make himself the benefactor, or so he claims. So when Roan was shot dead, Hale received a juicy $25,000 payout, equivalent to almost $500,000 today. But is Hale related to the other murders? Certainly, Ernest, Molly's husband, was a nephew of Hale. Ernest, like Hale, had no ancestral ties to the Osage. He was therefore assigned by the American government to be Molly's guardian. Now, I don't think I've told you what a guardian is, but essentially, the government didn't like the Osage people controlling so much money, so they gave each member of the tribe a trusted guardian who would have control over their finances. The guardian would approve purchases and document the Osage spending. But there was lots of corruption, and guardians stealing money from the Osage was as abundant as the oil.
I feel like this is one example of the people ultimately in power, which tend to be white men, that I think they're just getting really, really jealous of the oil wealth that the Osage they are accumulating, and I think that's why you have such guardian systems in place, because it just feels like a very convenient way to keep stealing money.
Indeed, and naturally, the guardians tended to be white men. So it was considered fortunate when an Osage woman married a white man who could then be assigned her guardian, just like in Molly's case. Unfortunately, this didn't go so well for Molly. It's suspected that Hale encouraged the subservient Ernest to fall in love with Molly from the very beginning, setting his eyes on her family's immense wealth. So whilst Molly became filthy rich through these murders, Ernest still had control over the money, and Hale had control over Ernest. It's alleged that Hale tried to poison Molly and eventually kill Ernest too, so that he'd get all of their head rights and money, but thankfully it didn't get that far. The FBI, or as it was known back then, the Bureau of Investigation, eventually took a closer look into the Reign of Terror. They had actually tried to solve the cases early on, yet they quickly gave up and left because they just didn't care about the Osage people. But after the organization was facing public scrutiny for incompetence, they took another crack at this case to prove their worth. And they solved it. It was some top quality detective work. So after much corruption and influence from Hale delaying court proceedings and bribing jurors by years, he was finally convicted for a life sentence. Hale actually should have been given the death penalty, but a white man killing Osage Indians barely seemed like a crime to most Americans back then. So even getting him charged in the first place was a huge success. Ernest, meanwhile, was also convicted because he had collaborated with Hale and was aware of most of the murders. As you'd expect, Molly immediately divorced him upon pleading guilty. Though Molly was actually convinced that Ernest was innocent throughout the investigation, and only once the trials were complete did Molly really realise and grapple with the truth, at which point she was absolutely horrified. Molly regained her bearing in life, and remarried, living out her days with as much peace as she could have hoped for after the terrible years of hopeless defeat from death and fear. However, as David Gran explores in his book, there were many, many more deaths in the Reign of Terror. Many deaths unaccounted for in official documents, let alone the Bureau of Investigation's investigation. While Hale killed many of the Osage, it was but a fraction of the real count. We will never know what truly happened to the Osage in this period. But through scouring the records and witnesses, Gran has speculated on some additional killers and conspirators. The Osage lived in constant fear, not knowing who would be next. They drank their moonshine completely oblivious to the poison lurking within, poison that took so many people down with it. Almost everyone was directly affected by the murders, and yet many remained shut. Those who were outspoken and sought justice were killed. Just as one attorney boarded a train and disappeared for good, his shattered skull found beside the track days later. Even the guilty Shun brothers, the dangerous Dr. Jewett who played their part in plenty of deaths, were left alone. Osage Nation was full of bribery and corruption. Everyone had a price, and the Osage could always pay it. The American government didn't really care about the nitty-gritty details of the murders and the many other criminals who killed for head rights. They just pinned everything on Hale. So, after condemning him to life for a couple murders, the Bureau of Investigation left Osage Nation and the criminals within it. Interestingly, after Hale was sent to prison, the murder spree stopped. Perhaps the rest of the killers decided that they had enough and that they got away with their deeds, which they did. Hale, in fact, made his riches through fraud and crime, mostly targeting the Osage. And this was not actually widely known at the time, but those who didn't know about Hale's deeds wouldn't even think of denouncing Hale in public. He was just too influential, too popular, and too loved. But this does make me question, why did he go through all the hassle of orchestrating so many murders? He already had more than $10 million in today's money, and the acceptance and love from the Osage people. What motivated him to continue? Well, unfortunately, we'll just never know. Looking upon this case 100 years later, the story is striking. It's almost unreal. But Gran's book, The Killers of the Flower Moon, is a great example of investigative journalism, and I recommend the read if this segment spiked your interest. If you were to go to Osage Nation and visit the museum today, you'd see a wall with a huge panoramic photo of many members of the tribe. But in one corner would be a ripped outline of part of the photo, missing. William Hale. The pain from the Reign of Terror is deep-rooted in the Osage culture and lives on today, generations later. But for now, remember that danger can lurk anywhere, and keep those you truly trust close to you. Build a moat between you and everyone else, because you never know. History may repeat itself, and the Reign of Terror may next take you with it. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this story, smash those like and subscribe buttons. The full episode can be found in the description, alongside our weekly newsletter and the sources that we used. Bye.